My father wiped his hand on a folded white handkerchief before he reached for Charles Whitmore. Not because his hand was dirty, because he knew where he was. A five-star dining room, crystal glasses, marble floors, men in tailored suits, women who smiled without warmth. My father had spent 30 years restoring old wood with those hands. Church doors, hotel staircases, theater ceilings, things rich people photographed, praised, and paid fortunes to preserve. But that night, when he offered his hand to my fiancé's father, Charles Whitmore looked down at it like it didn't belong in the room. He looked at the calluses, the small cuts near the knuckles, the faint stain of walnut oil that no soap could fully remove. Then he lifted his wineglass instead. "I'm sure you understand," he said softly. "Some hands are better suited for workrooms than dinner tables." The table went silent. My mother's face changed first. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a small tightening around her mouth, the kind of hurt women of her generation were taught to swallow. My father lowered his hand slowly, and I turned to Julian, my fiancé, the man who had promised, only 3 weeks earlier, that once we were married, his family would become mine. I waited for him to speak, to laugh it off, to correct his father, to say, "Don't talk about Robert that way." But Julian only looked down at his plate and whispered, "They're old-fashioned, Emily, don't make it worse." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly enough for anyone else to hear, but enough for me to know the wedding I had been planning was no longer the future I thought it was. 6 weeks later, Charles Whitmore stood outside my parents' small house in the rain. His expensive coat was soaked at the shoulders. His wife, Victoria, stood beside him without her usual smile, and Julian stood behind them, pale, silent, and unable to meet my eyes. This time, Charles was the one reaching out his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low and uneven. "Please. Our company won't survive without you." My father looked at that hand for a long moment, the same hand that had refused his. Then he said quietly, "6 weeks ago my hand was too rough to shake. Today, it's steady enough to save your company?" And for the first time since I had met the Whitmores, no one at the top of the table had anything to say. But to understand how Charles Whitmore ended up on our porch, begging my father for help, you have to understand who Robert Carter was. My father never introduced himself as an artist. He never called himself a master craftsman. If people asked what he did, he said, "I fix things people gave up on." That was it. He said it the same way whether he was talking to a neighbor with a broken chair or a museum director with a collapsed antique staircase. His workshop sat behind our house, behind a crooked blue door. It smelled like cedar, dust, lemon oil, and patience. He could run one thumb over a crack in a wooden panel and tell you whether it came from water, heat, age, or neglect. When I was little, I asked why he didn't just replace broken pieces with new wood. He looked at me and said, "Because new isn't always better, Em. Sometimes the strongest part of a thing is the part that survived." I didn't know then that he was teaching me more than restoration. My mother, Helen, used to joke that Dad could repair anything except his own good shirts. They were always marked somewhere. A line of varnish on the cuff, sawdust near the collar, a small tear near the elbow. But on the night of my engagement dinner, he wore his best navy suit. It was not new. It was not expensive. But my mother had pressed it until the seams looked sharp. He stood in front of their bedroom mirror, tugging at his sleeves. "Do I look all right?" he asked. My mother fixed his tie. "You look like yourself," she said. He looked at me. "Is that good enough for the Whitmores?" I laughed because I thought he was joking. "Dad, it's more than good enough." I believed that then. I believed Julian loved me enough to make room for the people who made me. I had no idea that some people do not need to raise their voices to humiliate you. They only need to decide you are beneath them and behave as if everyone else has agreed. Julian Whitmore came from the kind of family whose name appeared on buildings, gala programs, scholarship plaques, and charity boards. His father owned Whitmore Heritage Interiors, a luxury restoration and design firm that handled hotels, private clubs, theaters, and historical estates. His mother, Victoria, hosted fundraisers in rooms where the flowers cost more than my first car. When Julian and I met, I was working as a junior designer on a boutique hotel renovation. He was charming in a way that felt almost effortless. He remembered small details. He sent coffee when I worked late. He asked about my parents with what seemed like genuine interest. And the first time he came to my parents' house, My father treated him like family before Julian had earned it. That afternoon mattered more than I realized. Julian had brought an old music box with him, wrapped carefully in a gray scarf. It had belonged to his grandmother. The lid was warped, the brass key was loose, and the little ballerina, inside, no longer turned. My mother says it's not worth fixing, Julian said. But my grandmother loved it. Dad did not ask how much it was worth. He did not ask whether the Whitmores would pay. He just put on his glasses and leaned close. Well, he said, let's see if it still wants to sing. Julian watched him work for nearly an hour. When the music finally played, faint but clear, Julian went still. The little ballerina turned again. Julian touched the edge of the box like he was afraid it would disappear. You saved something I thought was gone, he said. Dad only smiled. No, he said. I reminded it what it was built to do. That was why Julian's silence at dinner cut so deep. Because he knew my father's hands were not dirty. He knew what they could restore. He knew those hands had held something precious to him with more care than his own family had shown my father in return. And still, when the moment came, he chose the comfort of his family's approval over the dignity of mine. The Whitmores chose the restaurant. Of course they did. Victoria called it intimate, though the private dining room was larger than my parents' living room. It had high ceilings painted with gold trim, a fireplace no one needed, and windows overlooking the city like the people inside had personally arranged the skyline. My mother whispered. Goodness, when we stepped in, not because she was impressed by wealth, because she was the kind of woman who noticed how much effort human beings put into making other human beings feel small. Victoria kissed the air near my cheek and said, Emily, darling, you look lovely, very simple. Simple. I would learn later that in Victoria's language, simple could mean elegant, inexpensive, unfinished, or not quite one of us. Julian squeezed my hand under the table, a private gesture. At the time, I thought that meant he was on my side. Now I know there is a difference between holding your hand under the table and standing beside you above it. Charles entered last. Tall, silver-haired, perfectly dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being treated as if his opinions were facts. My father stood too. He smiled, stepped forward, and reached out his hand. That was when the room changed. Charles looked at him, then at his hand. My father had wiped it moments before with the little white handkerchief my mother had packed into his jacket pocket. Charles did not meet him halfway. I'm sure you understand, he said. Some hands are better suited for workrooms than dinner tables. No one laughed. That almost made it worse. If someone had laughed, I could have called it cruelty and known what to do with it. But the silence made it feel official, like a judgment had been passed and no one in the room intended to appeal it. My father lowered his hand. My mother reached for his sleeve. Just 2 fingers. Not to stop him. Not to comfort him in a way others would notice. Only to remind him he was not standing there alone. I looked at Julian. He looked away. I waited. He adjusted his napkin. My heart began to pound. Say something, I thought. Please. Just 1 sentence. Julian leaned toward me and whispered, They're old-fashioned, Emily. Don't make it worse. Don't make it worse. As if I had injured the room by noticing my father bleeding in it. If you've ever watched someone you love get disrespected while everyone else pretended it was just manners, you already know why silence can hurt louder than an insult. I sat through the rest of that dinner with my hands folded in my lap so no one would see them shaking. Victoria asked my mother whether she was comfortable in formal settings. My mother smiled politely and said, I'm comfortable wherever my daughter is loved. Victoria's smile thinned. Charles asked Dad how long he had been doing repairs. Dad said, Restoration. 32 years. Ah, Charles said. A specialist word. Dad did not flinch. He had spent too many years listening to old buildings groan to be shaken by a man trying to sound taller than he was. Then Charles began discussing the project that would later bring him to our porch. The Marlowe Grand. He said the name as if it already belonged to him. It's the kind of contract that defines a firm, he told the table. Historic structure, luxury repositioning, full public attention. We'll be restoring the grand staircase, the ballroom ceiling, the walnut-paneled lobby. Investors are watching closely. Victoria touched his arm. Charles is being modest. The Marlowe Grand will make Whitmore Heritage the name and preservation luxury. I saw my father look up slightly when Charles mentioned the walnut-paneled lobby. Just a flicker. A craftsman hearing the name of an old patient. Do you know the building? I asked him softly. A little, Dad said. Charles heard and smiled. It's rather specialized, Mr. Carter. Dad nodded. Most old things are. For the first time that night, I saw Charles recognize that my father was not intimidated. That bothered him more than poverty did. Poor people were supposed to be grateful in Charles Whitmore's world. Grateful to be invited. Grateful to be tolerated. Grateful to be near the table, even if no one meant to make room for them at it. By dessert, Charles made a toast. To Julian and Emily, he said. May they build a life worthy of the family they are joining. The family they are joining, not the families joining. My mother looked down. My father stared at his water glass. Julian smiled weakly, and I realized the toast was not a blessing. It was a warning. After dinner, my father stepped outside into the cold air and flexed his fingers once. I saw the small red marks near his knuckles from where he had been sanding a carved banister that morning. Dad, I said, my voice breaking. He turned and smiled at me. Not the full smile. The one parents use when they are trying to keep their child from feeling responsible for their pain. Don't, he said gently. I'm sorry. You didn't do it, but I brought you here. He looked back through the glass doors at Julian's family. Then he said, a person shows you who they are, by what they're willing to be seen touching. On the ride home, Julian texted me. I'm sorry tonight was awkward. Awkward. That was the word he chose. Not cruel. Not humiliating. Awkward. I stared at the message until the letters blurred. That night, I took off my engagement ring and placed it on the dresser, not because I was ready to end anything, but because suddenly, it felt heavier than it had that morning. Julian came over the next afternoon with flowers. Not for my father. For me, that told me more than the apology did. He stood on my parents' porch, holding white lilies wrapped in expensive paper. When I opened the door, he smiled like a man, hoping the shape of his mouth could erase what he had failed to say. Can we talk? My parents were at church, so I let him in. He looked around the living room as if seeing it differently now. The handmade bookshelf, the dining table Dad had built for Mom, the repaired armchair with mismatched fabric because my mother had loved the original too much to replace all of it. Julian had once called the house warm. That day, he looked uncomfortable. I spoke to my mother, he said. I waited. She agrees Dad's comment could have been phrased better. I almost laughed. Your father refused to shake my dad's hand, I said. I know. No, I don't think you do. He exhaled. My dad has a certain way of seeing the world. It doesn't mean he hates your father. That's your defense? I'm trying to explain. No, Julian, you're translating cruelty into manners because that makes it easier for you to live with. His face tightened. That's not fair. You know what wasn't fair? My father wiping his hand before he offered it to yours. Because he wanted to be respectful. And your father looking at that hand like it was something he found under his shoe. Julian closed his eyes. I should have said something. Yes. I froze. You whispered. His eyes opened. What? You didn't freeze. You whispered. You told me not to make it worse. He looked ashamed then. For a second, I saw the man I loved. Not the Whitmore son. Just Julian, who had cried over a broken music box in my father's workshop. I panicked, he said softly, and I learned something. What? That when your family hurts mine, your instinct is to manage my reaction, not their behavior. He had no answer. That became his pattern. Silence when truth required cost. Over the next 2 weeks, Julian tried to repair things without touching the broken place. He sent long messages about stress, complicated family dynamics, and how weddings made everyone emotional. He said his mother was willing to host my parents for brunch in a more relaxed setting. I asked whether Charles planned to apologize. Julian said his father was not really an apology person. That phrase stayed with me. Not really an apology person. People say that as if it is a personality type, like being introverted or bad with names. But refusing to apologize is not a personality. It is a decision to let other people carry the weight of your pride. Victoria, meanwhile, continued planning the wedding as if she were acquiring a smaller company. She changed the floral palette without asking me. She replaced the local baker my mother loved with a French pastry chef she called more appropriate. She sent a revised seating chart where my parents were placed 2 tables away from the Whitmore family. When I called her, she sounded surprised. Oh, darling, your parents will be more comfortable there. More comfortable away from the family table? There was a pause. Well, I simply thought they might prefer less attention. Less attention. My parents were not loud people. They did not drink too much. They did not tell embarrassing stories. They did not ask for money. Their only offense was that the Whitmores could not show them off. And for people like Charles and Victoria, anything they could not show off had to be hidden tastefully. One evening, I found Dad in his workshop, restoring the curved arm of an old chair. His sleeves were rolled up. His hands moved with the same steadiness they always had. "Does it ever bother you?" I asked. "What?" "When people act like what you do is less than what they do." He sanded the edge slowly. "Less often than it used to." "What changed?" He smiled a little. "I got older. Figured out most people who need to put you below them are standing on something hollow." I looked at his hands. "Why didn't you say anything that night?" He stopped working. "I've spent my life with fragile things," he said. "If you hit every cracked surface, Emily, you don't prove you're strong. You just break more than you fix." But he deserved it. "Yes. So why not?" "Because your mother was there. You were there. And I was not going to let that man turn me into a performance at my daughter's engagement dinner." That was my father. His calm was not surrender. It was control. Before I left, he placed one hand on my shoulder. The same hand Charles had refused. "You don't have to decide everything at once," he said. "But don't marry into a room where your heart is expected to stand alone." I cried in the car before driving home. Not because I had made a decision. Because part of me already had. The crisis at Whitmore Heritage Interiors began with a sound no one could ignore. A crack, not a dramatic collapse. Not dust pouring from the ceiling. Just one sharp crack from the north side of the Marlowe Grand Lobby during a structural inspection. It echoed through the empty hotel like a gunshot. The Marlowe Grand had been built in 1912, back when hotels were designed like declarations. The lobby had carved columns, a sweeping staircase, stained glass panels, and a coffered ceiling darkened by time. The Marlowe Grand had no connection to my family. It was just an old hotel with an old name until my father's hands became the only thing keeping its future standing. Whitmore Heritage had won the contract after promising not only to restore the hotel, but to preserve its historic soul. The problem was that souls, historic or otherwise, are harder to preserve than they are to sell. The problem was hidden inside the grand staircase. Years of moisture had weakened the old walnut supports, and every easy solution created a worse problem. Add modern steel, and the lobby would lose the historic beauty Whitmore had sold to investors. Remove the original panels, and they could violate the preservation agreement. Leave everything untouched, and the hotel might fail inspection completely. Within days, the project went from prestigious to dangerous. Panic began moving through the company like smoke under a door. Julian told me none of this at first. I heard pieces of it through industry gossip. A designer friend texted me, "Is Julian's company okay? Heard Marlowe is a nightmare." I didn't respond. The wedding was still technically on, though I had stopped saying that out loud. My dress hung untouched in the guest room. Victoria continued sending emails about menu tastings and guest transportation. Julian continued insisting everything would be fine if I just gave his family time. And I continued waking at 3 in the morning, with the image of my father's lowered hand moving through my mind. A hand offered. A hand refused. A hand lowered slowly so no one else would have to feel ashamed. The emergency meeting at Whitmore Heritage began at 7:15 on a Monday morning. By 7:40, Charles had stopped pretending it was just a delay. By 8:10, the investors had used the phrase, material breach. The Marlowe Grand was not just a contract, it was the contract. Whitmore Heritage had borrowed against future work to expand its fabrication studio. They had hired new staff. Charles had given interviews about it. Victoria had hosted a donor preview in the unfinished ballroom and called the project a love letter to legacy. The more people spoke, the worse it became. One engineer said the staircase could be stabilized, but only with changes the preservation board would hate. A design director said those changes would destroy the very beauty Whitmore had promised to protect. A finance director warned that delays could scare investors. A legal advisor warned that rushing could make everything worse. Charles finally slammed one palm on the table. "Then tell me what works." No one answered, until an older consultant named Martin Hale cleared his throat. Martin had been brought in by the investors, not by Whitmore. He flipped through the proposal. "You said here you intended to use the Carter method." Charles nodded sharply. "Yes. Our team is familiar with it." Martin looked over his glasses. "No, they aren't." The room went still. Charles's face hardened. "I beg your pardon? You're familiar with the phrase." "Not the method." Martin tapped the drawing. The Carter stabilization method was developed for exactly this kind of problem. Original wood under structural stress, preservation restrictions, minimal invasive reinforcement. But it's not a manual you download. It requires judgment, touch, sequence. You have to know how the old joints respond before you ask them to carry anything new. The project manager shifted. We've reviewed published notes. Martin sighed. Published notes are not hands. That sentence, Julian later told me, made him think of my father so suddenly he felt sick. Charles leaned back. Then find someone who has done it. Martin closed the folder. There are a few people who have assisted on projects using it, but if this building is as unstable as your reports suggest, you don't need someone who assisted. He looked directly at Charles. You need Carter. Charles frowned. We are using Carter. No. You're quoting Carter. You need Robert Carter. Julian's face went cold. Victoria looked up from her phone. Charles stared. Martin continued, unaware at first of the personal bomb he had just dropped into the room. Robert Carter. Small independent restoration shop. Not flashy. Doesn't chase large commercial work anymore, unless the building interests him. He developed the method 20 years ago on the Bellwether Theater restoration, after everyone else said the balcony had to be replaced. No one spoke. Julian did not move. Charles's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something uglier. Pride, realizing it needed a man it had insulted. Victoria recovered first. Well, she said, that is unfortunate, but surely manageable. Julian looked at her. Manageable? She gave him a warning glance. This is business. No, Julian said quietly. This is exactly what Emily was talking about. Charles turned. Not now. Yes, now. Charles's voice lowered. We have 72 hours before the investors escalate. If you want to be useful, call her. Julian shook his head. You should call him. Charles's eyes narrowed. I will not be lectured by my son, in front of consultants. Martin began gathering his papers. I'll step out. No, Charles said sharply. Stay. You said he's necessary. He is. Then we'll make an offer. Martin looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Whitmore, men like Robert Carter are not vending machines. You don't insert money and receive salvation. Charles ignored the warning. He had his assistant call. Dad's workshop. No answer. He emailed. No reply. He had the office send a formal inquiry with urgent priority. Nothing. Then Julian called me. I was at my desk reviewing fabric samples when my phone lit up. Julian. I let it ring. He called again. I silenced it. A text came through. Please call me. It's important. I stared at the words. Important to whom? Another message. It's about your father. My body went still. I stepped into the hallway and called him. What happened? I asked. Nothing happened to him, Julian said quickly. He's okay. Then why are you calling? He hesitated. Our company needs to speak with him. For a second, I thought I had misheard. What? The Marlowe project. There's a structural issue. We need the Carter method. The Carter method. Hearing those words in Julian's voice made something twist in me. Not because I was surprised my father mattered. Because I was surprised they had discovered it only when money was at risk. You mean your father needs my father's hands now? Silence. Emily. No. Say it. He exhaled. Yes. I closed my eyes. In my mind, I saw Dad lowering his hand in that dining room. If this is about my father's hands, I said, your father should speak to my father himself. Emily, please. The company could collapse. And 6 weeks ago, your father couldn't survive touching him. Julian went quiet. Do not call me again to soften the path for your father, I said. If Charles Whitmore needs Robert Carter, Charles Whitmore can find the courage to stand in front of him. I hung up. My hands were shaking. But this time, not from fear, from the strange force of finally refusing to make cruelty convenient. That evening, I told my parents everything. Dad listened, without interrupting. When I finished, he folded the dish towel and placed it on the counter. Did they ask you to ask me? Julian called me. Dad nodded once. What will you do? I asked. He looked toward the window, where the workshop light glowed through the rain. I'll wait, he said. For what? For Charles Whitmore to decide whether he needs help badly enough to bring his pride with him and set it down at my door. That was my father. Calm, but never available for use. Kind, but not convenient. A man whose hands had saved hundreds of things, and who knew exactly when not to lift them. Charles lasted 36 hours before coming to the house. Not because he became humble, because the investors became louder than his pride. The first sign was my mother looking through the front window and saying very softly, Robert. Outside, a black sedan had stopped at the curb. Then another. Charles stepped out first, raising one hand against the rain as if weather itself had inconvenienced him. Victoria followed, holding a black umbrella. Julian got out last. He looked at the house and then at me through the window. I did not move. Dad stood. He was wearing work pants and a gray sweater with a small tear near the cuff. His hands were clean but rough, the nails short, the skin marked by years no luxury cream could erase. "Do you want me to answer?" Mom asked. Dad shook his head. "No, I will." He walked to the door. Not quickly, not slowly for effect. Just with the pace of a man who knew no amount of money waiting outside could make him hurry inside his own home. He opened it. Charles stood on the porch, wet at the shoulders, his expression arranged into something close to respect but not yet familiar with it. "Mr. Carter," he said. Dad said nothing. Charles lifted his hand. There it was. The same ritual, different room, different weather, different balance of power. My father looked at the offered hand. For one breath, 2, 3. Then he looked at Charles's face. Charles's hand remained suspended between them, awkward now, exposed. "Mr. Carter," Charles said again. "Please. Our company won't survive without you." Dad did not take the hand. He did not step back either. He simply said, "6 weeks ago, my hand was too rough to shake. Today, it's steady enough to save your company?" Victoria's lips parted. Julian closed his eyes. Charles lowered his hand. For the first time, I understood what my father had done at the dinner. Lowering a hand can be humiliation when someone forces it. But lowering your own hand, before you have earned the right to offer, it can be the beginning of humility. Charles swallowed. I was disrespectful. Dad waited. Charles looked past him and saw my mother. Then me. His face tightened, like apology physically hurt. "I was disrespectful to you," he said. "And to your wife. And to your daughter." My mother's eyes shone, but she did not speak. Dad stepped aside. "Come in." We gathered in the living room. Victoria sat on the edge of the couch as if she feared the furniture might claim her. Charles remained standing until Dad gestured to a chair. Julian stood near the doorway, looking like a boy who had broken something too large to hide. Dad placed the Marlowe drawings on the coffee table. "I know the building," he said. Charles leaned forward despite himself. "You do?" "I studied it 20 years ago. Helped assess the lobby after a water leak. They didn't have the funds then for a full restoration." Charles looked uncomfortable. "We have 72 hours before the investors." Dad raised one hand, just slightly. Charles stopped talking. That small gesture said everything. In this house, urgency did not outrank respect. Dad said, "Before we discuss the building, we discuss terms." "Of course," Charles said quickly. "Your fee will be—" "I'm not talking about money first." Charles blinked. Dad folded his hands. "My team will be contracted directly. Not hidden under your company's labor line. Their names will be listed in project documentation. Their recommendations will not be overruled by someone trying to protect a rendering. If I say a piece cannot be rushed, it will not be rushed." Charles looked as if each sentence cost him oxygen. Victoria spoke. "Mr. Carter, we are prepared to be generous." Dad turned to her. "Mrs. Whitmore. Generosity is what people offer when they still think they own the higher ground. I am discussing professional terms." The room went quiet. Not tense. Clear. Charles nodded slowly. "Agreed." Dad continued. "Second, you will apologize to my wife and my daughter with the same clarity you used when you made them feel small." Victoria's face flushed. Charles looked at Julian. Dad noticed. "No," he said. "Not through your son." Charles looked back. Dad's voice remained calm. "Your son has carried enough of your cowardice." Julian flinched. "So did I. Not because it was cruel. Because it was true." Charles looked at my mother. "Helen," he said. "I apologize for the way I behaved at dinner. You and your husband were guests. I treated you without respect." My mother nodded once. "Thank you." Then he turned to me. "Emily, I apologize. I put you in a position no daughter should have to stand in." That one landed. Because for a moment, I saw that he understood at least the outline of what he had done. Victoria inhaled. "I also apologize," she said. "I made assumptions about your family, and I disguised them as manners." My mother's mouth trembled. Dad said, "Thank you." No forgiveness offered, no warmth added. Just thank you. A receipt, not a release. Then Julian stepped forward. "Mr. Carter." Dad looked at him. Julian's eyes were red. "I'm sorry," he said. "I knew better." Dad did not soften. "You did. I should have defended you." "Yes. And Helen. And Emily." Yes. I was afraid of my father. Dad looked at Charles, then back at Julian. That may explain your silence. It does not repair it. Julian's face crumpled slightly. I know. For the first time, I believed he did. But belief was not the same as return. Dad turned back to the drawings. I'll inspect the Marlowe tomorrow morning. Charles exhaled like a man pulled from deep water. Thank you. Dad looked at him. I have not saved your company. I have agreed to look at a building. That was the boundary, clear as a line drawn in fresh sawdust. After they left, I asked Dad, are you really going to help them? He picked up the drawings. I'm going to help the building. And them? If they follow the terms, they may benefit from that. Then he looked at me. Emily, do not mistake my willingness to work for willingness to forget. I won't. He nodded. Good. That night, I opened the closet where my wedding dress hung inside its white garment bag. I touched the zipper, but did not open it. Instead, I looked at my own hands. No calluses like Dad's. No walnut oil in the lines. But they were his hands too, in a way. Hands that could choose. Hands that could return a ring. Hands that could close a door gently and still mean it. The next morning, my father walked into the Marlowe Grand with a worn leather tool bag. No entourage. No performance. Just hands the Whitmores had once refused. Even unfinished, the hotel had presence. The lobby rose 3 stories high, with stained glass filtering pale morning light across the dusty floor. The grand staircase curved along the left wall in a sweep of dark walnut, carved vines, and old craftsmanship that made modern luxury look temporary. My father stood at the base of it for almost a full minute without speaking. Charles hovered nearby. So did Julian, Martin Hale, 2 engineers, the project manager, and half a dozen Whitmore employees trying not to look desperate. Dad walked toward the staircase and placed one hand on the banister. Gently. I saw Charles watching that hand. Maybe for the first time, he saw what he had refused. Not roughness. Knowledge. Dad closed his eyes briefly. Then he tapped 2 fingers against the underside of the rail and listened. No one moved. He crouched, ran his thumb along a joint beneath the carved panel, then stood and looked up toward the landing. Who approved temporary humidity control? The project manager answered too fast. We installed standard units. Dad shook his head. Standard for new materials. Not old walnut that has spent a century learning one room. The engineer frowned. Learning? Dad looked at him. Wood remembers conditions. Change them too quickly. It protests. For 6 hours, Dad inspected the staircase. He did not rush. He refused 3 calls from Whitmore executives asking for updates. He asked for older photographs, maintenance logs, original joinery notes, and access to the crawlspace beneath the lobby. When someone said, "The investors need an answer by tonight," Dad replied, "then they should have asked the building earlier." By late afternoon, he had his assessment. The structure could be saved. Not cheaply. Not quickly. Not with the cosmetic shortcuts Whitmore had planned. The staircase needed phased stabilization. Moisture correction. Custom support inserts hidden within original joinery. Several panels had to be removed by hand, labeled, treated, and reinstalled in sequence. Charles looked at the revised timeline. This adds 3 weeks. Dad said, yes. The investors won't like that. The staircase won't care. Charles stared at him. Can we compress any part of it? No. What if we increase labor? No. What if? Dad placed his hand flat on the drawing. Charles stopped. There it was again. The hand. No ring. No expensive watch. No smooth skin. Just a hand that had learned where pressure belonged. You brought me here because your version failed, Dad said. Do not ask me to dress it back up as mine. Charles stared at him. Then, slowly, he nodded. Fine. No, Dad said. Not fine. Agreed. Charles swallowed. Agreed. That evening, the Whitmore board gathered for a call with the investors. Dad was not invited at first. Charles assumed he could present the plan himself. Martin corrected him. If Robert doesn't explain it, they'll think you're hiding delay behind jargon. Charles hated that, but he invited Dad. The call began badly. Investors were angry. The preservation board was cautious. Charles opened with polished phrases about responsible restoration and adjusted timelines. No one sounded convinced. Then one investor interrupted. Mr. Whitmore, with respect, we've heard enough language. Can the staircase be saved or not? Charles looked at Dad. Dad leaned toward the microphone. Yes. The room quieted. The investor asked, who is speaking? Robert Carter. A pause. The Carter method, Carter? Dad glanced at Charles. Yes. That was the moment the balance shifted beyond emotion and into record. The investors knew his name. The preservation board knew his work. Charles had been ashamed to touch the hand of a man whose reputation his own proposal had relied on. Dad explained the plan in plain language. No performance. No inflated promises. He said what could be saved, what had to change, what could not be rushed, and what risks remained. He did not flatter anyone. He did not attack anyone. He simply told the truth so clearly that the room had nowhere to put its panic. When he finished, the lead investor said, "If Mr. Carter oversees the stabilization, we'll accept the revised timeline." Charles closed his eyes briefly. Saved, not by charm, not by money, not by legacy, by the man he had refused to shake. If this story is making you think of someone whose quiet strength was overlooked, hold their name in your mind for a second. People like that rarely ask to be honored, but they are often the reason everything around them is still standing. Work began the next day. Dad brought in his own crew: Luis, Marin, Theo, and Sam. People I had known for years, from summer barbecues and workshop emergencies. People with scarred hands, sharp eyes, and quiet pride. Whitmore employees watched them at first, with the curiosity-rich offices reserved for people who arrive carrying tools instead of tablets. But by the second day, curiosity became respect. By the fourth, dependence. Marin identified a hidden split in a support panel before it reached the surface. Luis designed a temporary cradle to hold weight without bruising the original carving. Theo spent 3 hours removing one panel no bigger than a serving tray because, as he told a young engineer, old wood doesn't forgive arrogance. When I visited the site after work, I found Dad kneeling near the staircase with Julian beside him. Julian was holding a light, not leading, not explaining, holding. Dad adjusted a clamp. "Higher," he said. Julian moved the light. "No, higher with steadiness, not drama." Julian almost smiled. For a moment, I saw what might have been possible if Julian had learned earlier that love sometimes means holding the light while someone else does the repair. He noticed me and stood. "Emily? Hi. You came to see my father." He nodded. "He's extraordinary. He was extraordinary before your family needed him." The words were not loud, but they landed. Julian looked down. "I know." We stood there in the half-restored lobby, surrounded by plastic sheeting, old walnut, and the smell of dust. "I don't want to be that man," Julian said. "I hope you become better." He looked at me carefully. But I don't know if I can build my life inside the place where you practiced being silent." His eyes filled. Before he could answer, Charles's voice cut across the lobby. "Julian, the press team needs." He stopped when he saw me. For the first time, Charles did not know how to address me. "Miss Carter," he said. "Not darling, not young lady. Miss Carter." A small correction. Too late to undo everything, but not meaningless. By the end of the third week, the staircase held. The inspection passed. The preservation board approved the revised work. The investors released the next funding phase, and Whitmore Heritage began preparing a public announcement about the successful stabilization of the Marlowe Grand's historic lobby. Victoria sent the draft press release to everyone. It was polished, elegant, and dishonest in the way only Victoria knew how to make dishonesty look tasteful. My father's name appeared once, near the bottom. "Special thanks to outside restoration support." Outside restoration support. After everything his hands had saved, she was still trying to tuck him into a footnote. Dad read it at our kitchen table. Then he picked up his phone and called Charles. He put it on speaker. Charles answered quickly. "Robert. We were just finalizing." "No." A pause. "I'm sorry?" "No," Dad repeated. His voice was calm. "My team's names will be listed. The Carter method will be accurately credited. The correction will be public." Charles exhaled. "The press release is a draft." Then drafted honestly. "Robert, surely we don't need to make this difficult." Dad looked at me, then at Mom, then said into the phone, "Charles, I am not making it difficult. I am refusing to make it false." Silence. Then Charles said, "I'll revise it." Dad ended the call. That was his boundary. No shouting. No revenge. Just the steady refusal to disappear. Watching him, I finally understood what my own choice had to be. Not because Julian was evil. Not because I wanted to punish him. Not because I wanted the Whitmores to suffer. but because there are moments when staying would require you to shrink the truth so everyone else can keep the story pretty. And I was my father's daughter. I could not do that anymore. The public unveiling of the Marlowe Grand Lobby took place on a Thursday evening. 6 weeks and 2 days after Charles Whitmore refused to shake my father's hand. The lobby looked beautiful. Not new, better than new. It looked remembered. The walnut staircase curved through the room with a quiet strength that made people lower their voices without knowing why. The restored panels glowed under warm light. The stained glass scattered color across the floor. Reporters came. Investors came. The preservation board came. Whitmore clients came in black dresses, tailored suits, and expressions of careful admiration. My parents arrived together. Dad wore the same navy suit from the engagement dinner. My mother had pressed it again. This time, he did not wipe his hand before entering. I noticed that first. His hands were clean, of course, but he did not check them. He did not fold a handkerchief in his palm like proof he knew how to behave. He simply walked in. Helen beside him, me beside them both. Across the lobby, Charles saw us. He walked toward my father, slowly. In front of everyone. He stopped before him. "Robert," he said. Then he offered his hand. This time, my father took it. Not eagerly, not warmly, but firmly. A handshake, not forgiveness. A professional acknowledgement, not a rewriting of history. Cameras flashed. People smiled, thinking they were witnessing partnership. Only a few of us knew they were witnessing the closing of a wound that would still leave a scar. The ceremony began near the staircase. Charles stood at the podium, with the Whitmore logo behind him. Julian stood off to the side. I could feel his eyes on me, but I did not turn. Charles gave the expected remarks first. He thanked the investors, the preservation board, the city council, the design team. Then he paused. "There is another acknowledgement I need to make tonight," he said. The room settled. When Whitmore Heritage took on the Marlowe Grand, we believed our resources, our reputation, and our ambition would be enough. We were wrong. A few people shifted. The central staircase behind me was saved because of the expertise of Robert Carter and his restoration team. Luis Alvarez, Marin Pike, Theo Bennett, and Samir Rao. Their work did not merely preserve a feature. It preserved the integrity of this building. My father stood still. His hands rested at his sides. Charles looked down once, then back up. And on a personal note, I owe Mr. Carter and his family a public apology. Several weeks ago, I failed to show him the respect he deserved. I judged the hands that built and restored things I have spent my career profiting from. That was not sophistication. It was arrogance. The room was completely silent now. My mother's hand found mine. Charles turned slightly toward us. "Robert, Helen, Emily, I am sorry." 3 words. Late. Insufficient. But public. Clear. No decoration. No excuse. Dad nodded once. My mother squeezed my hand. I felt something inside me loosen. Not heal completely. Just loosen. A knot no longer pretending to be part of me. After the speeches, people gathered around Dad. Investors shook his hand. Reporters asked about the Carter method. Young designers asked if he ever taught workshops. Martin Hale clapped him on the shoulder and said, "About time they learned your name in rooms like this." Dad smiled. "I always knew my name." That was my father, in one sentence. The world catching up did not make him more valuable. It only made the world less wrong. Julian found me near the edge of the lobby, beside one of the restored panels. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you." He seemed older than he had 6 weeks ago. Not dramatically, just enough. Some lessons do that. They do not transform you instantly. They remove the luxury of pretending you do not know. "My father meant that apology," he said. "I hope so. I did too." "I know." His eyes searched mine. "Can we start over?" That question hurt more than I expected, because part of me wanted to say yes. Not the wise part. Not the healed part. The tired part. The part that missed the easy version of love before truth entered the room. Julian stepped closer. "I'll do whatever it takes, Emily. I'll go to counseling. I'll move out of my parents' orbit. I'll make sure nothing like that ever happens again." I believed he wanted to mean every word. But wanting to become brave after cowardice has a consequence is not the same as having been brave when love needed you. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the ring. His face changed before I said anything. "Emily." I held it in my palm. The diamond caught the lobby light. For weeks, that ring had felt like a question I was afraid to answer. Now it looked small. Not worthless. Just small, compared to my father's lowered hand. Compared to my mother's quiet face. Compared to the life I would have to live if I taught myself that being chosen by Julian mattered more than being safe beside him. I'm giving this back, I said. He stared at the ring. Because of one dinner? No. My voice was gentle. That mattered to me. I did not want cruelty to become my proof of strength. It's because at that dinner, I saw my future. And I finally loved myself enough not to walk into it. His eyes filled. I can change. I hope you do. Then why can't we? Because I don't want to be the place where you practice becoming someone who should have protected me already. He looked like the words had knocked the air out of him. I placed the ring in his hand. His fingers closed around it. Smooth fingers. Shaking now. I loved you, I said. I love you. I know. That was the saddest truth. Love was there. But love without courage had left me standing alone in a room where my father's dignity was treated like dirt. And I could not build a marriage on the hope that next time, Julian might choose differently. I walked away from Julian and found my parents near the staircase. Dad looked at my face and knew. He did not ask for details. He simply opened his arms. I stepped into them like I had when I was little. His hand rested on the back of my head. That same hand, the hand that had built my bed, fixed Julian's music box, lowered itself in humiliation, held a building together, shaken Charles Whitmore's hand only after the truth had been named. For a moment, I let myself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to release the future I had almost entered. Mom touched my shoulder. Ready to go home? She asked. I looked around the Marlowe Grand one last time. At the staircase. At the lights. At the people admiring what my father's hands had saved. Then I looked at Julian, standing alone with the ring in his palm. I did not feel victorious. That surprised me. For weeks, I had imagined that leaving would feel sharp. Like revenge. Like triumph. It didn't. It felt quiet. Clean. Like setting down something heavy and realizing your hands are still yours. Yes, I said. I'm ready. We left through the main doors together. Outside, the night air was cool. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still shone under the streetlights. Dad offered one arm to Mom and one to me. We both took him. At the curb, he paused and looked back at the hotel. You did good work, I said. He smiled faintly. So did you. I didn't restore a staircase. No, he said. You restored the part of yourself that almost agreed to be treated badly. That broke me a little. In the best way. A week later, the revised Marlowe Grand article came out. The headline read, "The Hands That Saved the Marlowe." There was a photograph of my father standing beside the staircase, one hand resting on the restored rail. Not posed like a celebrity, not polished into someone else's idea of important. Just Robert Carter. Steady, skilled, unmoved by rooms that had taken too long to recognize him. Julian sent me one final message. I'm sorry I learned courage too late. I read it twice. Then I replied, I hope you keep learning. And that was all. No speech. No final wound. No door slammed hard enough to echo. Just a boundary. Some people think self-respect has to look dramatic to be real. It doesn't. Sometimes self-respect is returning a ring with a steady voice. Sometimes it is letting an apology be true without letting it become a key back into your life. Sometimes it is choosing not to marry a man you still love, because the version of you who would have stayed deserved rescuing too. My father went back to his workshop the next Monday. There was no grand announcement, no luxury car, no new attitude. He made coffee at 6, kissed my mother's cheek, and opened the blue workshop door before the sun fully rose. When I arrived later that morning, he was working on an old dining chair with a cracked leg. Another impossible case? I asked. He looked up over his glasses. Not impossible, just neglected. I sat on the stool by the doorway, the same place I had sat as a child. His hands moved over the broken wood. Slow, careful, certain, and I finally understood why people trusted him with old things. Not because he could make damage disappear, he never promised that, but because he knew how to honor what had survived, without pretending it had never been hurt. A hand does not lose its worth because someone refuses to shake it. A life does not become smaller because a wealthy room cannot recognize it. And love is not proven by how someone holds your hand in private. It is proven by whether they will stand beside that hand when the room decides it does not belong. And if there is someone in your life whose quiet hands held everything together while others looked down on them, I hope this story made you think of them. My father saved their company. But more than that, He saved me from marrying into a family that only respected hands when they needed them. And if this story stays with you, let it stay for the right reason. Not because Charles Whitmore was finally humbled, not because Julian finally regretted his silence, but because Robert Carter never had to become cruel to become powerful. He simply kept his hands steady and taught his daughter to do the same.